Hello, everybody. I'm entitling this little mini lecture, The Greek Question. We're going to start to do a lot of Greek material in the course. So that means coming from the ancient Greek world, so ancient world, region of Greece, and in fact, ancient Athens more specifically. So we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between ancient Greek and ancient Athenian material. But it's important to know a little bit about the context. This isn't a history course, so we're not going to do a lot of context. But a general picture can sometimes help you get a sense of what's important to the things we're reading, what these authors of these texts care about. We did this a little bit with Confucius. You can probably call to mind a couple things that you've learned now about the context Confucius was in. He was in ancient China, almost a good 2,500 years ago. The society he was from was very hierarchical. And it was during what was called the Warring States period of ancient China. So lots of conflict, lots of war, lots of strife. The ancient Greek world we're going to be interested in is about as old as the Confucian material. It was also a hierarchical society like ancient China. So not just in terms of class and wealth. So a few people with a lot of stuff and a lot of people without much stuff. But also hierarchy in terms of political power. And there too, a few people with a lot of political power and a lot of people with hardly any political power. And so the question about that power, that's context for the ancient Greek material, is who is it that gets to make the important decisions about society? And why do they get to make them? Like where does the power come from? And there was very generally a way that this power would work in the ancient world that would explain why some people have the power and other people don't. So before I paint a little picture about how that worked in the ancient world, I want to introduce you to a professor at Stanford, Professor Ian Morris. Ian Morris often comes to the SLE program at Stanford to lecture, usually gives a couple of lectures in the fall quarter when we do the ancient Greek material. He's an archaeologist, so he studies the ancient world. Most archaeologists are trying to figure out what was happening back then. But then there are some archaeologists who try to use that knowledge of what was happening back then to think about what it might tell us about our world today. And Ian Morris is that type of thinker. He has a book that was that did really well in the bestseller list. I don't know if it was actually a bestseller, but sold a lot of copies. And it was called Why the West Rules for Now. And the subtitle was The Patterns of History and What They Reveal About the Future. That's an interesting book. The argument in a sentence is that who has ruling power in the world, so who has global power, is often a matter of geography more than anything else. Where that power, where that state is, where that nation is, what kind of resources they have, that kind of thing. And so by studying the ancient world, Professor Morris tries to make an argument that helps us understand how the world works today. So we're going to do a little bit of that with this idea of the Greek question. Professor Morris wrote a textbook on the ancient Greek world called The Greeks, History, Culture, and Society, which he co-wrote with another archaeologist, classicist named Barry Powell. And it's in that book that they talk about this idea of the Greek question, which brings us back to how political power worked in the ancient world. Now, the story I'm going to tell is just a mini lecture, so it's very quick and it generalizes quite a lot, but it gets at something that was true. And to put it in reverse a little bit momentarily, the ancient Greeks we're going to study, the ancient Athenians society, was super weird given the context of the ancient world. It was very unusual. And so the idea of the Greek question is to get at what was so weird about these ancient Greek societies. Well, the way political power worked mostly in the ancient world throughout centuries and across the globe was that those special people, those few people who had a lot of political power, usually claimed their power by saying that they had some kind of special access to gods, maybe they were gods themselves, to some kind of supernatural power. So they were making the argument, in other words, that they were in fact different people. They were different kinds of people, that they were special people, but that specialness was access to this other realm, and therefore they should be entrusted with political power because they have access to what the gods want. They have access to supernatural knowledge. So why wouldn't the rest of us let them make all of the decisions? So the phrase we can use to sum that up is godlike kings. That most ancient world political structures depended on the idea of godlike kings. A few people, maybe even one person with an entourage, but that one person or those few people being in some sense godlike, having special status, special connection to special powers. Now, for some reason, and Professor Morris says we don't really know why, the ancient Greeks, these city-states, Athens being one of them, these ancient Athenians decided they just weren't going to do that anymore. Now, it's quite possible that there must have been some dissatisfaction with the way that system was working, because you have to have a reason to want to change in the first place. But we don't know if there's a lot of other reasons that help make this happen. But suddenly, out of that context of godlike kings everywhere, these little city-states appear that want to do it differently. And so they started to ask, and this is the definition of the Greek question, how are we going to live if nobody is telling us how to live? How are we going to live if nobody is telling us how to live? So that gets at the idea that we're not going to listen to godlike kings anymore. Nobody's going to have a special status. Nobody's going to be able to claim that everybody should listen to them and to nobody else. And they had to solve that problem. If that's not the way it's going to work, then how will it work? Well, the answer they gave is familiar to us. So we're weirdos too. And it's impacted how our society works. Because their answer was to try a form of democracy, try voting as a political structure, try just talking about the problems you're trying to figure out as a society. And if you can't fully agree, then have some kind of system of voting so that you can make decisions and move forward. Now, before we get past that little innovation of democracy, I want to make it very clear that in these ancient city-states, the democracy still belonged only to a few people. Not everybody could participate in the democratic political structures. Still very hierarchical society, still a society where some people have a lot more wealth than other people, a lot more social status. It was a slave society. There were slaves in these ancient Greek city-states, as there were throughout the ancient world. Very few examples of ancient societies that did not use some form of slavery. And so you had to be a landowner to participate in this new experiment of democracy. You also had to be a man. No women were allowed to participate in these new democratic forms of government. So still very restrictive, but a completely different approach to figuring out what to do. No more special access people, nobody claiming that special status. And have to use democratic mechanisms, democratic processes to decide how to make our decisions as a city-state, as a society. So that was radically new. So even though there are those problems, it was a radically new way of thinking about political power. So that's a very important part of the context of the ancient Greek world, ancient Athenian world that the texts we'll be looking at come out of. So Antigone this week, and then we'll have some philosophy coming with Plato and Aristotle. That they come out of this context of a new form of government, of trying to figure out a new way of solving problems together. A new way, in fact, we use the phrase from the title of this course, of searching together for the common good. So to figure out what's good for society moving forward, this weirdo society from the ancient world decided, let's try to figure it out collectively, at least a few of us, land-owning men, instead of listening to people who claim a special kind of power. And that in that way, the Greek question is still very much with us. It's in a way an American question. And to our credit, we've expanded who can participate in democracy, although our democracy still has a lot of problems. But it's the job of our democracy, the job of our political system, to ask that question: how are we going to live if nobody's telling us what to do? And democracy is an answer to that Greek and now American question.